Thank you for joining us for today's Corporate Governance Roundtable discussion. I'm Ko Han Wei, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for this session. So we have an exciting and timely discussion ahead of us today, exploring how sustainability is evolving beyond carbon and climate, particularly in the emerging area of nature and biodiversity finance. As we know, the global sustainability agenda is shifting. Companies and investors are increasingly recognizing that nature is not just a moral or environmental concern, it is a material financial issue. And understanding and managing nature-related risk and opportunity is becoming essential to long-term business resilience. So this is a critical topic for our businesses, investors, and policymakers who are looking for ways to integrate environmental considerations into corporate strategy and governance. So to help us navigate this conversation today, we are joined by a distinguished and diverse panel of thought leaders and practitioners who each bring a unique perspective on the intersection of sustainability, finance, and governance. So I will invite our panelists to speak a few words about themselves, to share a little more of their background and the area of their focus. So first up, we have Ms. Audrey Liang, who is Director of Nature Finance at Standard Chartered Bank. Audrey, please.
Thank you so much, Hanwei. Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'm Audrey from Standard Chartered Bank based in Singapore and sitting within the Chief Sustainability Office. Because within sustainability, there are many emerging topics. So we have set up that innovation hub. Within innovation hub, we have the carbon markets, adaptation finance, nature financing, circular economy, along with the adaptation and resilience financing. So I sit within the nature hub and we really look at it from an opportunistic lens and a risk angle. Given that nature risk is really driving and increasing and growing in space, we are trying to understand how risk will evolve, right? And therefore, this will guide the way we do our opportunities. Alternatively, we also actually look at it from an external engagement to really drive collective action to reduce nature loss. So we are part of many memberships. We are also an early adopter of the TNFD. So nice to meet everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Next, we have Professor Hao Liang. Professor Hao Liang is one of our globally recognized academic in this sustainability area. He's an associate professor of finance and co-director of Singapore Green Finance Center at SMU. So, Professor, please say a few words about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Hanwei, and thanks for inviting me to attend this very interesting roundtable discussion. I have been at SMU for a bit more than 10 years. My main research and teaching focus is on the intersection between sustainability and finance. And as Hanwei just mentioned, I'm a co-director, mainly focusing on academic matters of Singapore Green Finance Center, which was set up by Monetary Authority of Singapore 5 years ago, and we are going to continue for at least another 5 years. And Standard Chartered, together with other financial institutions, are our co-founders. We focus on research, training, industry engagement with our industry partners on a range of green finance related topics. And in recent years, nature biodiversity finance is a big focus. And I also began to conduct some research in this area in terms of quantifying the risk related to biodiversity loss, and also how to measure the impact of business operations on the nature. So glad to meet everyone here.
Thank you so much, Prof. Next, we have Dr. Joshua Kuma, who is Honorary Secretary of SIAS and Managing Director at EQT. So, Dr. Joshua, please share a few words about yourself.
Well, good morning, all. Thank you, Hanwei, for really taking time. I know you are in New York time zone. You're up now and joined the call. From SIAS, I really appreciate each and every one of you. Thanks, Shilpa, for just joining. I know last night you had a big Diwali dinner at Ritz-Carlton. Prof. Hao Liang, really appreciate your time. You really changed your time, travel, etc. to join us. Audrey, appreciate you. Myself, I'm serving as a volunteer in SIAS as a honorary secretary. And also the last term, we have set up a new committee called Green and Sustainability, where I'm chairing that initiative. We are really working very hard to take care of the interests of retail shareholders. On the other side, I'm also the board member of Singapore Green Singapore, Green ESG. I'm really passionate about this green sustainability, nature, and biodiversity. It's not really as passionate as Prof. Liang. I heard so much about you, Prof, and all your papers. But to some extent, during my days in NUS as a professor, then move on to equity now as a managing director, we have initiated quite a fair bit of things. I'm happy to learn more from other panelists. At the same time, we'll be happy to share some of the SIAS initiatives. Thank you very much, and let us spend more time on the Q&A and the sharing of knowledge and information to all the participants who are eagerly waiting, especially Prof. How, you and Shilpa, yourself, and Audrey, not myself in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Joshua. Last but not least, with Ms. Shilpa, who is the head of Sustainable Finance Institutional Banking Group at DBS. Ms. Shilpa, please say a few words about yourself.
So firstly, thank you very much for this invitation. Very happy to be here on the panel. A very good morning to all the audience. I head Sustainable Finance at DBS. Within this perimeter, what we focus on is various thematics, as also alluded by Audrey. These are really becoming the thematics of the new finance world. That being said, at DBS, we are organized by sectors. So we have one vertical where my team focuses on hard-to-abate sectors, which are typically the oil and gas, metals and mining. Then you have the shipping, aviation, logistics, and transportation, as well as the petchem side of the story. Then we are a Singapore headquartered Asian lead with a global footprint. So we clearly can't stay away from real estate. So we have another vertical which takes care of real estate, FIs, as well as the auto. And we have the next vertical which takes care of the more upcoming sectors, data centers, food and agri. And that's where, we really focus transversally. So I know whenever one thinks of biodiversity, one generally tends to think to do with only agri space, but actually now biodiversity implicitly or explicitly is getting embedded in portfolios, in investor interactions, so on and so forth. And very look forward to the discussions today, learning from all of you all and sharing some of the experiences with clients and transactions.
Thank you so much, Shilpa. Thank you all for the introduction. It is great to have such a wealth of experience and viewpoints represented on our panel today. So, now that we talk about nature and biodiversity, we have heard a lot in recent years in terms of sustainability, environmental, and climate risks. What is now clearer to many of us is that nature and biodiversity loss is emerging as an equally critical issue, and they represent a parallel and interconnected risk that directly affects business community. So the World Economic Forum ranks biodiversity loss amongst the top global risks to business because companies are deeply dependent on functioning ecosystems, whether for water, raw materials, soil productivity, crop stability, or even a social license to operate. So nature loss is now not just an environmental problem, it is also a disruption to the real economy and value chain. So the first question, maybe for Professor Liang. So from an economic and systems perspective, how should companies understand the loss of nature and biodiversity? I mean, not just as an environmental issue, but as a core business and financial risk that can affect their productivity, supply chain stability, and long-term enterprise value.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the question. First, I think you also mentioned at the beginning, the discussion nowadays have been shifting from climate change, carbon emission, climate-related risks to focus more on nature-related risks, loss of biodiversity, etc. If we go back to 10, 15 years ago, I think there was a lot of debate about, whether climate change is a real financial risk. And I think at that time, people came up with the classification of climate-related risk in terms of physical risk and also transition risk. Physical risk, of course, extreme weather, sea level rise, etc., that directly hit companies' cash flows, whereas transition risks are related to changing climate appetite, policy regulations, carbon price, etc. So I think by now, there is a large consensus that climate risk is a financial risk, both physical and transition. When we talk about nature-related risk, biodiversity-related risk, we also make similar classifications. There's physical risk and there's transition risk. I think we are talking a lot about transition risk at this moment because after the UN Montreal Declaration and UN SDGs, there are policies, there are regulatory pressures on companies to be mindful about their biodiversity impacts, and therefore companies nowadays they feel the pressure mostly from the regulators. However, I think a big question mark remains is what's the physical risk of biodiversity loss? From my personal interaction with people in the industry, as well as some recent published papers in this area relating to physical biodiversity risk to investor reaction, there does not seem to be a clear pricing mechanism of the physical risk, which is of course understandable for most business, unless you are in certain industries such as food, agriculture, pharmaceutical, which your revenue crucially rely on nature and biodiversity. Physical risk is not something that happens to you in such an obvious way in the next 3 to 5 years. So I think this is the current situation. But as you also mentioned, that we are living in an interconnected world. We have very complex value chain. Everybody lives on food, on agriculture to some extent. So if those industries they face immediate physical risk from biodiversity loss, this will trickle down to other industries, to each individual. Therefore, I think here we are making a sort of a trade-off between something that may not immediately materialize, especially physical biodiversity or nature risk, versus something that can happen in the long run, but we just don't immediately feel. I think, therefore, although companies nowadays and investors nowadays, they face mostly the transition risk coming from the policy pressure. I think there is also a rationale for why we should care about all this risk, because policymakers, they think probably from the longer term perspective, what would happen to loss of species in 10, 20 years on the whole economy. And therefore, certain policies are made. And therefore, I think there is a good economic argument for why companies should react, not just as a compliance issue, but actually thinking about hedging against long-term risks. So this is sort of my high-level summary.
So in terms of from investors' perspective, maybe for Shilpa and for Audrey, what roles do you think that investor can actually play, in influencing corporate behavior in this area? To kind of look at considering how would the loss and nature and biodiversity comes into play? How do you think maybe kind of investors can play a role here?
So let's talk about what was really the conversation with investors until even say 2 years ago. So I'm not talking about distant past. Investors typically, when they focused on sustainable finance bond issuances, and here I will talk about the debt side, fixed income side of the story. When you took a sustainable finance to them, typically it was either a green or it was a sustainable, which was green with a social impact, and that's why you labeled it as sustainable, or possibly even social as a label which has been picking up in the last 3-4 years, typically after the health crisis that we saw in form of COVID. Until then, even when we used to take projects such as hydro project, geothermal project, there was very, very little or no questions around nature impact in general. Nature impact can be very broad. It may not only be biodiversity, it can be pretty broad. And that's where adaptation, resilience, biodiversity, all of this they form the same side of the club. The focus was more around, of course, energy. The focus was more around carbon intensity, so on and so forth, which continues to remain even in renewable projects such as hydro, geothermal, etc. But what is changing, and I wouldn't say has changed, but is changing, that today when we are taking bond issuances to roadshows or non-deal roadshows, investors are actually getting more and more interested in the outcome of the ENS work done. ENS, just for the benefit of all, ENS basically is like a due diligence for most of the institutions, and I can definitely, Audrey, I take the liberty to speak on behalf of both our institutions, which are committed to the Equator principles. When we actually look at a project, we also have to assess it from a do no significant harm, but an environmental and social harm perspective. So, what is the project all about? Where is it located? What are the physical risk elements that we are looking at? What kind of damage on biodiversity or any other form of nature that this project can lead to? Can it lead to some other kind of risks which do not exist at this point in time, which could be floods, which could be earthquakes, etc., etc.? And this kind of study, until now, was a checklist. So yes, it is done. We are committed. We've done the study and we present it and we move ahead with the project, and therefore we financiers move ahead with the project finance structuring. But now I'm slowly, gradually, I won't say it is very uniform, but it's gradually happening, and it's quite pleasing to see that investors are taking a lot of interest that when this ENS study is being done, what are the results? Is XYZ in terms of biodiversity or any other form of nature being taken care of when you're talking about a geothermal or a hydro kind of a project, or even a wind? What is happening to the bird migration in a particular season where you are setting up the windmills? So these are I would say developments or thoughts moving in the right direction. I wouldn't say we are yet there. Maybe a little later in this conversation, I can possibly elaborate on why we are not yet there. But here is where I would invite even Audrey to share her views and thoughts and experiences.
Thank you so much, Shilpa. I mean, really echoing the point on investors focusing on the outcome, right? And that's why that whole monitoring, reporting, and verification is really coming through. How do we report? How do we do a proper MRV? But within nature itself, because there are so many indicators, what is the right baseline that we should be taking? What are the right KPIs that we should be factoring into this project? And there is a multitude of data out there, but choosing the right outcome indicators is proven to be a challenge. And that's why, as banks, we always try to push the ecosystem to help streamline what are the right KPIs that we should be looking at. Sometimes looking at biodiversity, a KPI may not be the best case for a certain project itself, right? Like what Shilpa said, nature or biodiversity is really huge. We look at it from a water, from a land, from a pollution perspective. And that's why we need to drive common consensus across. I think one key point from a nature perspective is from a project or investing perspective. A lot of these projects are not bankable or investable per se that we see now, right? From our perspective, we see bankability as predictable cash flows, able to quantify that nature risk, which we are really still at the initial stage of that journey. We really need projects to be scalable so that it can fit existing financial products. We don't want it to be on extremely new innovative products, and then it's tough for the banks to structure or for people to come in and start investing in. So there are a lot of ways that we can try to leverage this and push this to scale, but we are really still not at that initial stage like what Shilpa said, and so we're still waiting for market to really consolidate, to come together to see what's the best approach to approach nature related kind of yields. You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. So I mean, it's actually very interesting in a way, and it kind of like leads us to kind of like the second section of like our this particular discussion today. We talk about like measurements, we talk about like values, we'll talk about solutions. Before we even talk about measures, maybe we kind of look at in terms of like why the strategic rationale in that sense. So for Dr. Joshua, you have worked with like companies, including your own employer, and across like different investment portfolios. They've achieved impressive sustainable outcomes. The very impressive, very colorful, very informative sustainability report that you see. So from an investor and value creation perspective, what are some of the compelling business reasons would you highlight for integrating nature and biodiversity considerations? In other words, what makes it essential to the strategy rather than just a nice to have add-on?
I think, Hanwei, we may have differences in our Green and Sustainability Committee meeting. You are the committee member. I may have given some hard time for you, but you cannot ask this kind of tough question to me. You put all the nice, easy question for Prof. Liang and Shilpa and Audrey. Yeah, you keep talking good about Audrey. So I don't know how to answer you this tough question. Maybe I'll take a position on the commercial world. Let us look backwards. Years ago, everybody looked at sustainability of the business, then slowly move on to add green due to various issues, especially the whole game, the policy started by the Europe. Yeah, so most of the commercial companies started to look into green and sustainability. Yeah, green and sustainability. So then we have created green financing, green bond, and many other things. From SIAS perspective, we promote that initiative. That means we propagate the retail investors whom we represent in Singapore to look at the companies who have implemented green and sustainability, so that these companies are really responsible, and there is a high chance for the shareholders' value or the share price may go up, so that the retail investors will benefit. So that is our overall business strategy, and it worked to some extent. At this point in time, of course, sorry, the colleagues from MAS and SGX who are on the call now, but we have all our time to discuss and learn each other. So we want to be very clear. The policy alone may not really work well with the business segment, that is public listed companies. And the policy alone will not pressurize the people unless there is a commercial benefit. Like the founder of SIAS always say, what is the benefit for the public listed companies to implement green and sustainability? So let us come back. The trend is towards, due to one or two or handful of so-called, I hate to use the word, but I have no choice to be very clear, it's greenwashing. Yeah, couple of bad examples happen in the world, though it is a different parts of the world. So that means putting from one side of the pocket to the other side of the pocket. So that means push the so-called mistakes or intentional things against green and sustainability, park it under the different umbrella, so that this side of the pocket looks so nice and good, etc., etc. So the green financing everywhere you can tick, tick, tick. But if we look at as a nature, you can't do that. The whole my jacket is only one jacket. I can't move from this pocket to this pocket because we are fully responsible. So if we look at that angle, it is very important for all of us to explore nature. Of course, that is again connected to biodiversity. So in the commercial sense, if I can share some statistics, almost $44 trillion as per the journal papers, $44 trillion of the business, about half of the global GDP, yeah, half of the global GDP. And some countries higher or lower is rely on nature and biodiversity, mainly due to food and other products, water and ancillary products. If we are not really worried about nature and biodiversity, and we continue to rely on or thinking about greening, sustainability and the negativity, so we are not going to enjoy any benefit. And we are going to tarnish current good GDP level of $44 trillion. On top of that, almost like 1 billion human beings, 1 billion human beings are getting either the food or livelihood rely on forests and the nature, so-called the nature. If we are not going to worry about the nature, continue to destroy, continue to just close the eye, the livelihood, food for these 1 billion people, we are going to make sins. So we should not. So I just want to leave some thoughts. These are the pressure points, the essential reasons the corporate sector and the list goes, or even human beings, should escalate ourselves few steps higher, that is nature and biodiversity. Thank you.
So maybe as a follow-up question, you know, obviously, I think a lot of companies, organizations wants to play a role in terms of like, playing a part towards like becoming nature positive, minimizing nature and biodiversity loss. What do you think are some actionable steps that companies can take today, to start integrating nature and biodiversity into their sustainable strategy?
You still stick to me with the questions?
You can arrow to your fellow panelists.
There are a couple of good and bad examples. This is a way to share the message for the benefit of listeners and our regulators or audience. In the olden days, the four-wheel drive moved from petrol or diesel to something like LNG cars, liquefied nitrogen gas. So many parts of the world, LNG cars are very popular, including Singapore. Not that popular. So over a period of time, the EV cars overtook. So the companies who invested in LNG cars or LNG terminals to supply even petrol kiosks, they have to close down because of EV car emergence. So even the next step on this value chain, a lot of predictions, hydrogen cars will take over because EV cars, mainly they are using the electrons are not clean electrons. Majority of such electrons produced by using coal-fired power plant, etc. So is evolution happening over a period of time? But if we compare nature and biodiversity, it's more or less at this point in time, many of them, the experts would conclude is we are covered both. But for the investors, the financial side of it, currently we are using green financing, green bonds, green credits, etc. So in my view, I would be happy to see so-called the nature credit concept in US and other parts of the world can be expanded further to nature and biodiversity credits. Yeah, I'm not here to introduce new words, but I'm trying to say the first evolution happened with the green finance and bond we are promoting. There is no doubt about it. So we should escalate ourselves to the next level, which is a nature and biodiversity credit or the bonds. So almost, I would say, zero chance for anyone or the angelistic person to create greenwash. And there will not be any negative talk in the market. So they are doing the greenwash. So I should not invest my hard-earned money as a retail investor. So two messages I want to leave it out. Evolution happened. So end of the day, the green and sustainability is, can be go to the next level, nature and biodiversity. And the second point is nature and biodiversity credits and the bond. So that will be the ultimate solution to zeroize any negative talks and comments in the market. Thank you.
So Shilpa, what do you think? What are some of the practical actions that companies can take from your standpoint from a financial institution?
In fact, Dr. Joshua actually took this conversation to a very thought-provoking dimension, which is talking about nature credits. Now, if we look at the existing voluntary market, so now I'm going to take that cue and possibly move on to that. If we look at the current form of credits, which is the voluntary market credits, where you have NBS as one of the verticals under which we have various projects, right? I will share a real example and then I will share my thoughts. So this discussion is actually with a shipping company. You see, shipping companies are now focusing both on the voluntary and the compliance market. Compliance market because of the IMO regulation that is going to touch. I will not touch upon that in the context of today's topic. But shipping companies, some of them who are well advanced in their decarbonization journey, who are very well committed on multi-angle of ESG, are very consciously evaluating NBS projects for their residual emissions from an offset standpoint. Now, this conversation is with a company which says that whilst I can very well avail credits which are cook stove or renewables, etc., which typically these days are not very expensive. They are possibly in the, I mean, depending on the project location additionality. So you can't paint it through one brush, but you could avail credits $10, $15 per unit. They're actually evaluating in the sourcing of these credits a possibility of mangrove, so blue carbon, mangrove projects along the coastlines, which also dwells well to their business model because they are all about, ships are all about using water as the medium of moving from one point to the other. But in the event, they also realize that there is definitely some or the other harm being done to the environment underwater. And therefore, they would like to look at projects from an offset perspective where they can preserve some of the other angles surrounding coastlines, etc. And that was very encouraging because that conversation for a change, and I'm very candid in mentioning for a change, was not about, get me the cheapest credit. Yeah, it was about if there are interesting projects in the ASEAN market around mangroves, well certified, credible, we would be very keen to have it in the mix. Now, this voice actually comes from the top of this company, whereby the thought process is that there is some responsibility that we have towards nature, or you call it building adaptation, resilience, etc., for the business model that we have. So that was very, very pleasing. There are not many such cases. I'll also be quite honest about it. But this was quite pleasing. Now, this was more the example, but thought process is that we definitely can do a lot with the voluntary markets. Again, alluding to what Audrey said, that some of the projects in the voluntary markets, which are in the NBS space, require a very well-structured financing, and it requires players beyond the regular banking players to come into picture. It requires the concept of first loss being taken care of. It requires the capability of understanding projects which are very small in terms of ticket size, but if you multiply, you may get a decent base, and then one needs to assess the risk and thereby be able to finance it. Is some shape size of private credit have a potential into this space? Definitely a food for thought. But with that, I would, open it up to more thoughts from the other panelists on this piece.
Anything to add from your side, Audrey?
Yeah, sure, definitely. I think back to your question, right? Like you mentioned, how can corporates take action? I think first and foremost, they must really try to understand what is their business operations, impacts and dependencies on nature, right? Then you can really identify what are the key thematics to address, not only at your direct operation, but across the value chain, right? I think that's really understanding what is it first and how material your activities are on nature. And then by understanding what is it, I think the next question is what is the motivation of your management and your board trying to channel towards doing something within nature itself. If nothing is top down, nothing can be driven, right? So I think maybe just to call upon an example, for example, within Standard Chartered, how we really make nature into actionable items is we align ourselves with the Global Biodiversity Framework. We want to drive action towards 3 of its target. For example, integrating nature into our decision making, disclosures on nature itself, right? And the next bit is really we want to be a TNFD adopter because we need to start understanding how to measure our risk. By using TNFD leap approach, we can then use that approach to understand our impacts and dependencies on nature and how we can then work towards that. And for example, from a banking perspective, a lot of our activities which impact or are dependent on nature is at our, if we look at it, it's at our scope 3, right? At our value chain. What are the companies that we finance itself? And therefore, we realize that we need to work collectively with our clients to determine how can we channel or mobilize capital towards nature positive outcomes. Another key thematic is that we are very focused on the blue economy this year. We are we actually joined the Back Blue and Ocean Finance Commitment to channel sustainable ocean financing. And that actually really supports our net zero commitment also. So I think it needs to be collectively across how can you address nature loss, right, through different means based on your current business activity. So an agri player will work very differently from an oil and gas player versus a metals and mining player, depending on what kind of impacts you infringe on. Is it from a water consuming perspective, a land use change perspective? So I think we really need to understand where that materiality sits to then determine what is the actionable item that the company needs to take. Because I think bearing in mind, there is competing budget within the corporate, right? There is competing ambition also. So really focusing very on materiality will really help to drive true action, which will drive change.
So we have talked about the strategic rationale, some of the actions that, companies can kind of start taking. But of course, one of the more important factors that people will be asking about, how can we actually measure in a sense? So Prof has kind of done a lot has presented extensively, in terms of valuing biodiversity impact on companies and portfolio. So Prof, what are some of the meaningful approaches that we have today in terms of measuring nature-related impact and dependencies? Even if the data is imperfect. Earlier we spoke about there are a lot more data now that is as compared to 2 to 3 years ago. There are still imperfection in terms of the data. So how can companies actually use some of these measures to kind of make informed real decision making?
Okay, first, I totally agree with you. Management is a key issue. I think my fellow panelists were talking about nature credits, other biodiversity-related products, and a key sort of assumption is that those credits, those treatable products, they are properly measured in terms of their biodiversity impacts. I think a few years ago, Guardians published an article basically saying the vast majority, I don't know the exact number, probably 80% of those biodiversity credit projects are actually fake. So they when you carefully verify those projects, they don't really deliver the impact as they claim to be. So I think this really highlights the importance of measurement. And measuring biodiversity impact is somehow different from measuring climate-related impact in the sense that biodiversity is much more diverse. You have too many aspects to look at. You have, the species diversity. You have, even genetic diversity. You have the ecosystem level diversity. So it's not like you just look at your carbon footprint, scope 1, 2, 3. It's much more complex than that. Therefore, I think at this moment, a lot of frameworks are proposed, and many of them are under the Global Biodiversity Framework. And you also hear about BES and other international framework. But when it comes to specific species in a specific region, how do you actually quantify the impact? I don't think we have a well-established metrics yet. And there's also another challenge is how you link those impacts to companies' actions, right? So even without many economic activities, biodiversity still change. Even without human activities, temperature still fluctuates. So how do you within an ecosystem there are a lot of business. How do you attribute a certain impact to a particular business? I think that's also a huge challenge. Of course, given all these imperfections, we still try to move ahead to develop some measurement approach, basically drawing from different global frameworks and also drawing from academic research, because I'm a financial economist by training, but I realized that when it comes to measuring biodiversity impact, you need to hear more from ecologists, from people who actually work in those fields, rather than sitting in office to look at GDP, etc. So I think one effort we made is to partner with Impact Institute as well as a few globally renowned ecologists to come up with a methodology using global impact database for which we can link sector and country level biodiversity impact by the impact type and by the species to dollar value. So the idea is, if you see a company having operation in this region, you sort of roughly calculate, how much value loss this is associated with. Of course, most of the impacts are biodiversity loss, but you also think about ecosystem services, which bring positive value to the company. Many companies depend on those ecosystem services. There are also positive cash flows, but for the time being, everybody like positive cash flows, but what you really want to draw people's attention is the loss. So we focus more on what's the dollar value loss in biodiversity due to companies' operation. Of course, I can spend another 3 hours talking about methodology, showing you a lot of the mathematics. We don't have time, but this is the high level idea. And to me, I think only when you tell decision makers, whether companies or investors, in monetary unit, then they begin to relate to their real investment, their returns, right? So if you just tell them things in natural units or showing pictures, these are still nice, people are still moved, but it's a bit hard for them to compare with their real monetary decisions. So I think that's why this motivates us to start this project, and we do get some very meaningful results, which at some point later next year we will also publish.
I think this is kind of like a very important progress here, important milestone, I would say, when we can kind of like measure, even though we may not have like the most perfect data. I think that's kind of like in terms of like the starting point where we can measure something, we kind of like learned and we kind of like refine and then further improving them after going through a few iterations. So we talk about framework. I think Audrey mentioned like, the global biodiversity framework. We also talk about the TNFD. So what do you think, like in terms of like what roles do frameworks like TNFD play in creating a common language for assessing nature-related risk and opportunity? Maybe Prof or Audrey, would you like to talk about the framework? Like, what frameworks do you think they play?
Sure. I think for Standard Chartered, I've mentioned, right, we are an early adopter. So how we really leverage it is that TNFD gives us a lot of structure and consistency, right? It gives us the 4 key pillars of managing and how to assess dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And it's really very similar to how TCFD is. So it gives us a lot more comfort because we've done TCFD before, and it's just a little bit of alteration in 3 of these 14 disclosures, okay? So it also allows us to improve transparency through science-based and location-specific information, because TNFD makes us do that locate and evaluate towards nature interfaces, allowing us to really look at how to evaluate at the value chain. So this allows us from a banking perspective to identify key hotspots and then align how we do our due diligence or actually engage with clients better. It also allows us to increase our accountability towards integration of governance and risk management. Though I may say that we are still very in the early stage of nature risk kind of measurement, but it allows us to have some kind of framework on how to disclose how our existing environmental or climate risks are, and then how we can slowly in the future potentially integrate it in. I think one really key point is for us is to really catalyze better data and for client engagement, allowing it to have the same framework across the ecosystem, right? It drives data providers to really want to improve data for corporates across, also from a geospatial providers, and they also leverage really science-based tools. So for us, from a banking perspective, this really drives conversation with our clients to understand how their operations are dependent and actually impacted on nature. And the last bit is really, if many people use the same kind of framework, it can then allow more comparability and investor confidence. And that's why we can allow us to actually do comparison, for example, across sectors, across countries, and allow us to see across, for example, other kind of disclosures like TCFD and ISV kind of disclosures.
So in terms of we talk about nature credit, it's obviously one of the emerging kind of like financial instruments that's out there in the market. How do you think these emerging instruments, maybe even ecosystem service payments or even blended finance vehicles, be integrated into like mainstream financial strategy, rather than silo itself by just a nature projects? Maybe Shilpa?
So again, blended finance is an extremely important piece in this. Like I said, we need the players, we need the DFIs to play their role in promoting some of these projects. But let me again take an example, because I think things are best served when we have examples in front of us. So we actually financed a project called Karyan Water in the city of Jakarta, which was a 25-kilometer of clean water pipeline, which made clean water accessible to certain parts of Jakarta and beyond. First, I'll talk about the financing structure, and then I will talk about the impact, because the impact is not exactly obvious. So the structure was a blended finance structure. So there was ADB coming in on the public side, DBS was on the private side, and you had KEXIM, an ECA provider, was because it's a project finance at the end of the day. So we had KEXIM from an ECA perspective. And a unique structure wherein blending, you have even an ECA as a part of it. Now, what this project does is it facilitates access to clean water to certain parts of Jakarta and beyond. Very naturally, one would think that, yes, this is social because people are having access to clean water. But we also have to remind ourselves that this is city of Jakarta at the end of the day. We are not talking about a tier 3 rural area which doesn't have any access to clean water or sanitation, etc., etc. Actually, when we studied this project and saw the impact in detail, this reduces the dependency on groundwater. And that is where you are actually leaning towards adaptation and resilience. And we all know the challenge that Jakarta as a city is facing for the past many, many years. So this is an example which I'd like to put forth, saying that blended finance will play a very important role. Bankability is extremely important. And for us, the private side of financing to come into picture, we will need the partnership with DFIs and other players in the ecosystem which can mobilize private capital.
And I think obviously from an investor's or from a company's perspective, in a sense, sometimes they kind of like want to look into solutions of nature and biodiversity. But they feel that, I might need some financial assistance, financial help from like financial institutions. So from financial institution perspective, what is the willingness in terms of like offering additional incentives? Maybe say a preferential interest rates, better loan terms, or other financial benefits, so that clients can be proactive in terms of implementing biodiversity measures. Audrey?
Sure, I think that's a really interesting portion, right? Because I think I look at it as the greening finance. Greening finance is channeling financing towards the reduction of nature loss. Okay, so from a corporate perspective, this is a really key area where we see that demand, right, to halt and reverse nature loss. Actually, there's about more than 5 trillion of private finance estimated linked to these negative kind of related impacts. And that's why the corporate transition or the real economy years are really important to support this transition. So like what you mentioned, what are the key incentives which can help corporate to channel towards this? A very simple way could be a sustainability linked loan where with KPIs embedded in it. This is not a new product, but nature related KPIs can then be included as part of these KPIs. For example, a reduction in water loss or a reduction of a certain type of air pollutant, or for some instances, it could be increasing of a protected area of where the operations are. So it can be really used very differently. And within Standard Chartered, what we are really trying to do to support this transition is that we have actually developed an in-house kind of geospatial capability to really understand at an asset level of corporates, how can we then identify what is the corporate's nature-related impacts and dependencies, and therefore we can then provide suggestions on what kind of KPIs which are material enough, align with the corporate's ambition. Then we can see that these KPIs can then be factored into these SLL loans. So this is a very simple way of doing it, comparatively to do a bond, which is a lot more tedious process itself. So we are trying to help ensure that all these kind of KPIs or bonds are also aligned with market practices such as ICMA or IFC biodiversity guidance, because it's really critical to ensure that we do not infringe any form of greenwashing risk. Because from a nature perspective, there is always that key of that transformative activity or the additionality that we need to factor in to make sure that it is going above and beyond legal or BAU requirements.
So I think up to this point of our discussion today, we have the academic perspective. We also have the perspective from financial institutions. We also have the perspective from companies, from investment companies. So I think one part that we haven't really talked about is in terms of policy perspective, policy and collaborations. What are some of enabling conditions, whether is it policy, regulations, or even cross-sector coalitions are most needed to scale nature positive business models? I think this question probably for Dr. Joshua or for Prof. Maybe you can talk about, what do you think in terms of policy standpoint, and how can basically, government politicians kind of help in terms of driving this nature positive?
Okay, I'm happy to share maybe 2 points, and then of course Dr. Joshua have more to share, I'm sure. First, I think we all understand policymakers they can standardize reporting issues, and as Audrey just mentioned, right? So whether it's TNFD and the strength of its enforcement implementation, I think that varies a lot across countries, across different industries. I think this is one area that policymakers can help to make things more standardizable and to give clear guidelines and messages in terms of how companies should comply and what are the future pathways they can follow. We also talk about transition and blended finance earlier. I think these are also the areas which are very they have a high exposure to so-called greenwashing risks, because if you don't have a clear roadmap in terms of what are you going to do, how are you going to change in the next few years, you're just saying we issue this sustainability linked loans or bonds, and we are supporting biodiversity, but you don't have a proper metrics and pathways. It's very easy for companies to benefit from cheap talks simply by saying we care about it, but there's no way to verify it. Therefore, I think this is another area, and I think in Singapore, the regulatory bodies such as MAS has already been doing a lot in terms of developing proper taxonomy, giving clear guideline in terms of how blended finance structuring can work. How do you what's the first loss capital that you can think of from the public sector, from the philanthropic sector, and what are the projects that can properly leverage blended financing, transition financing instruments. So I think all these areas are what policymakers can do. And of course, as academic and who are also trying to get out of my own comfort zone by learning the subjects that are not in my PhD training, namely, nature science, ecology, etc., I began to realize, how much that academic insights can help with policy making. For example, earlier we talked about metrics, and a lot of metrics in biodiversity measurement is actually not from accounting, not from economics, but from satellite image, remote sensing. I think these are the areas that policymakers can give more supports, focus, and integrate them better into the policy discussions, which I think at this moment probably we are not doing well enough. So these are my initial thoughts. I'm happy to chat more later on when have more concrete ideas.
Thank you, Prof. This is the beauty of saying, Prof, please go ahead first, so that you cover most of the policy side of it, and I no need to go into detail of that. So if that is the case, maybe I will take a two-step back, look at how the whole business equilibrium works in this world. Either we can do regulators' policy, the government's policy, or do's and don'ts, or please do this or do that. It's something like Hitlerism, what the company should do, what they should not do. So that means the companies doesn't take ownership of what they're doing because of compulsion or the requirement they have to do. Then move on to the second logic, which is subsidy or financial rewards or the cost of implementation of anything. So, say example, green and sustainability or any adoption, the country like Singapore, we can say we will pay you 20 to 30% of the expenses of implementation. So you have some encouragement rather than putting your own company's profitability to invest. So this is the second model. And the third model is really you believe in that and you look at the new opportunity while you're running the business. It's like what Shilpa says about the transportation of clean water will reduce the sucking of the groundwater. That really improves quite a fair bit. So that kind of new model, in addition to the existing business operation. Maybe I will just give an example. The early days of adoption of green and sustainability, many of the companies, including some of our portfolio companies, during COVID time, shall we retrench the people because COVID, we don't know what to do? Or shall we do something else? So a few of them came and says, can we just make use of our good workforce to start to write sustainability manual, green manual for the company, instead of allow these people all please retrench, go. No. So they have done one or two companies just to retain with the 50% haircut of salary. So they have come up with a very, very nice green manual, sustainability manual, while they are sitting at home. So that become a good asset for that particular company. When the COVID is over, the company started to go full blast of actual business operation. The green and sustainability things, what they have written is fixed in the brain. So they automatically implement it. Finally come to the point, what I'm trying to say, the global big corporates look at such a company, your company have such a thick Bible that is green and sustainability manual in your company. Can I buy the company at substantially higher price? Because as a global corporate, I want to showcase I have such a company exists. So I can copy that precedence in that company. for my other companies. So I'm paying such a huge price to buy that company because of that. So that is the example I want to leave it across. In addition to the ownership of the corporate sector, there is a huge financial reward if you do that. Unfortunately, I can't name the company, but anybody can Google. I know a couple of our regulators on the line now, and we managed to get extremely a very good attractive pricing, so-called appreciation for the green and sustainability model. So likewise, now many companies may want to just start to think of nature and biodiversity model. How can they create that business model to benefit first mover advantage? Like many of them, especially the Gen Z community in Singapore or in the world, they try to do something on artificial intelligence. If they succeed, immediately they will get a couple of $100 million, a couple of $1 billion, depends on what. Yeah, the success rate is very high in the area of nature and biodiversity. The possibility of the companies or individuals are very high for them to succeed in the journey. That is a message I want to leave it out, rather than everything we must do the policy, or I will give some subsidy because of that, please do. I'm sorry, Prof, you have explained on the policy side, which I fully agree with you. So I want to take a slightly different angle or how to explain. Thank you.
So thank you so much, all the panelists. I mean, we have covered a lot of ground today. We have kind of had a very insightful discussion. So I kind of now would like to open the floor. I mean, we've touched on like risk, measurements, frameworks, government, finance, kind of I would like to open the floor now, to our audience for like questions that you kind of have for our panelists. I see in our Q&A box, there's kind of like a question that comes through from Adler Lim. So Adler's question, I'm not sure if you can see the question. So the question is, for a company, what is the most material nature risk that pose the biggest threat to business resilience and stabilities for over the next 5 years? What do you think, for a company? What is like the most material nature risk that could be a threat to the company in the next 5 to 10 years?
Maybe I can just based on some of the readings I have, and of course I also agree. I think water-related risk seems to be a quite urgent issue for most business, because the question is about the next 5-10 years, right? So given the potential risks for supply chain disruption and the reliance on water in many sectors, which further connect to other sectors, I think water scarcity, water quality, safety, this seems to be a quite urgent issue.
What do you think, Shilpa?
I would actually, agree with the direction that Prof has taken. But I would dwell back to what Audrey also mentioned, that, for us, we'll always think about how can businesses avail financing at the back of it. And therefore, again, summarizing the part, that frameworks, existing frameworks, and also specific frameworks that are developed for corporates will be directional. The role that financiers such as ourselves will have to play is to ensure that those frameworks give guidance on how do we structure the financing. And the incentivization here will be two forms. One is, of course, when you meet targets, all corporates, even today, look forward to lower pricing. What is increasingly happening is that financiers are emphasizing that don't do a transaction for pricing. Pricing is an output of a strategy that you are adopting towards sustainability, nature, environment, whatever you may want to call it. The other piece that I'd like to, use this question to answer, it came up during the conversation. that what kind of incentivization, right? So subsidy was touched upon. Audrey spoke about KPI linked loans, which definitely give you a carrot when you meet the KPIs. But in the capital markets world, when you are able to address a financing, whether it's use of proceeds, so it could be a biodiversity bond, or it could be a SLB in form of one of the KPIs, which is very relevant to your business, whereby you have targets on either reducing the damage or not doing the damage and actually proactively measuring it, or going all out to restore nature and biodiversity if that is measurable and possible. And that's where investors will reward you, because when you launch this bond, there is a lot of hunger from investors on thematics which are very clear and measurable. So it is not like there is no demand. What investors expect is very clear cut understanding that this is objectively measurable, because they definitely want to protect their own reputational risk when they are subscribing to certain bond issuances. And the incentive will come by way of demand for such bonds, which will firstly diversify your investor base. It will lead to a higher demand, and that diversification and higher demand will lead to a price squeeze, whereby ultimately the issuer will definitely be incentivized and will benefit with a lower cost of capital. So I have digressed a bit. I have used professor's guidance to elaborate a little more from a financer's perspective, but this is what I thought I'd bring about to the question.
Thank you. The next question we have from Jeannie Wang is also kind of like, what are the biggest barrier for financial sector in rapidly scaling up nature positive investment products and capital deployment? Audrey, would you like to take this question?
Sure, definitely. I think the first thing first is the definition of nature positive has not been agreed upon across the market. I think there's a lot of divergent views. And so with a common language being agreed upon, that would be really important on how we define it. This has been around for the past 2-3 years, and all the market initiatives cannot agree upon one. I think this is a very simple one. The next one is really on the lack of bankable projects, which we touched on just now. A lot of also projects are very small and fragmented, and therefore there's a lot of high transaction costs. And that's why the flip side to that is that can we do portfolio aggregation, reduce the transaction costs, share across the know-hows across portfolios of projects. The next one is really unclear pricing of nature outcomes, right? The financial materiality of nature has not been able to be determined, okay? And we are really having quite a lot of challenges to actually determine how to price nature in across the various different countries, because nature is so localized in that extent, okay? The next one is really maybe in terms of blended financing is really critical to come through, and therefore we need more thematic kind of blended financing to come through to support a lot more transaction. Take for example the case we did at Bahamas, that for nature swap within Standard Chartered, and that generated about 124 million kind of savings to this structure, and these savings were then channeled towards marine conservation. But in order for us to really structure such a large ticket kind of debt for nature swap, it was really critical to bring upon credit enhancer providers, and this allowed us to do a kind of a blended finance structuring. And this, where we actually see this is really coming through allowing private players coming in together with the government, along with insurance also providers, to come through to help provide that guarantee structure. And this will provide a lot more risk mitigation for any kind of deal. And therefore, the importance of driving private and public financing together will really allow more deals to get more support and reduce of its risk management practices.
So next we have Nicholas, who actually asked about executive compensation. To what extent should executive compensation and incentive schemes be tied to the achievement of measurable nature and biodiversity related targets? And what is the corporate governance role in establishing these matrices? Prof or Dr. Joshua, would you like to take this question?
This time I can't just push the things to Prof. Otherwise, he's next time you invite me, I'm not going to come anymore. Maybe I'll just say a little bit. Prof, please correct me and share your rich views. I'm not sure how much time we have. We have two more questions. Do you want to round it up together, or because you have a final say also? Now it's 11:15 our Singapore time.
I would also kind of like put out this other question as well at the same time, but I will leave my question to the last question for all of you. So the next question we have from Karen. What is the single most crucial action that a regulator, government, or stock exchange could take in the next 1 to 2 years to accelerate corporate action on nature from voluntary best practice to kind of like a widely adopted business imperative?
Sure, good. Thank you. Just so quickly, I'll just round it up for both. One is on the executive compensation. So this is not the matter for the company, listed company or private company, to have a budget to implement green and sustainability. Now we are moving towards nature and biodiversity. So it is an investment they have to make. And end of the day, there should be a separate classification for senior executives and the board of the company to establish what is the increase in the shareholders' value because of their small investment and the strategic ideas they put it up related to nature and biodiversity on top of the actual business process. Yeah. So there should be a clear demarcation. The value of the company, the share price has gone up so much just simply because of the implementation of nature and biodiversity. If that is the case, there is a financial reward for them. I do not want to go and say what should be the percentage of that additional profit or the savings for the company should go to the executives. I leave it to them. I would like to suggest there should be a clear measurement of increase in the value of the company due to nature and biodiversity adoption, and that should be rewarded. And number two, one single thing the regulators or MAS or SGX or governments should consider to do is quickly they should encourage companies to adopt from green and sustainability to nature and biodiversity. So this will kill many people's negative thoughts or criticism that is a greenwash. There is no nature wash at all. Nature is one nature. We all have to survive. So that is my point of view to say. Over to you, Prof. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Joshua. And for the first question about pay for biodiversity impact, I think in quite some countries, pay for ESG or pay for sustainability efforts is already there. And of course, what percentage of your pay that varies across sector and whether it's in the form of bonus or whether it's in the form of long-term plan. However, a bit different from pay for your ESG performance, which you can measure based on carbon emissions, based on ESG ratings. If you link pay to biodiversity impact, this can be quite tricky, precisely because the impact will only materialize in the long run, which is usually much longer than even the tenure of the executives. So I think, at first, I think both from the literature and also from the conceptual idea, this pay for performance idea is appealing, and empirical evidence has shown that when you link pay to ESG performance, indeed this drives more engagement in ESG. However, in the case of nature biodiversity, instead of saying instead of measuring performance as impact, perhaps given the nature of those impacts, we need to measure performance based on action. Impact is just taking too long time to materialize. Another issue is to avoid this phenomenon called pay for luck. In the executive compensation literature, for example, in oil company, there were certain times that oil company's stock price goes up just because oil price goes up due to geopolitical tensions. And so even the CEO, the managers, they do nothing, they still get better paid, and this is what we call pay for luck. So I think given currently there are a lot of buzzwords flowing around, a lot of hypes. I think and of course government policies. We are probably also going to see even a company does not do anything. The nature conservation efforts may change because of policy compliance. So I think how to design the compensation scheme in a way to distinguish between your genuine willingness to participate versus this is purely a compliance issue. Therefore, you are paying who is more compliant. I think this is another important consideration. The third is to have the proper governance mechanisms, especially in terms of board structure that steer such compensation design. And you probably need to, I'm just speaking aloud, put some ecologists on the board as remuneration committee to actually give science-based targets rather than things that are very hard to clearly quantify. So I think this is the area where the real science insights would actually matter quite a lot. And in terms of policy for regulators to do, and I realized that the question is actually about quite short time frame. I would say TNFD adoption, even making it mandatory, could be something that can happen relatively soon. We were talking about ISSB adoption, and I heard the recent debate is to delay this by 5 years, right? So even for ISSB, there are a lot of discussions, and of course TCFD later on they were incorporated into ISSB. So I think we are already having this issue, and if we really want to make companies aware of the importance of nature-related risks and incorporating TNFD into ISSB and don't further delay could be something that policymakers can take action in the relatively short period of time. Yes.
Thank you. So I have one last question, which I'll open to all of the panelists. What do you see as the most significant barrier, or maybe a single biggest challenge that actually prevents meaningful progress in terms of nature and biodiversity? So I will leave it to the panel, to all the panelists. Maybe Shilpa, Audrey,
maybe
Prof.
I'll set the base and then see the insights from others to learn. So for our day-to-day, this is definitely a topic which is surfacing quite strongly when we look at client engagement and when we actually work on transactions, irrespective of the sector, because each sector has a role in some shape, size, or form, which will encompass nature, biodiversity, any form of climate adaptation, resilience. Measurability and common alignment of understanding the impact of what the corporates are doing is extremely important for us financiers to be able to bring in investor interest as well as come together, because a lot of times when we are even financing at a corporate level, so it is not a project, because sometimes these projects may not be very huge in scale. Even if we are financing at a corporate level, any kind of transparency, alignment, guidance of understanding what are the perimeters that clearly define impact in that sector from a nature and biodiversity perspective will help us structure transactions and thereby finance and thereby even come up with KPI linked structures. Because ultimately, what banks and investors in any kind of KPI linked structures want is that you are objectively be able to show the progress that the corporate is committing to, and thereby availing financing at a beneficial rate.
Audrey?
I think really leveraging on what Shilpa has said, I mean, that is really critical, right? So I think with taxonomies, frameworks being developed that will help support a lot of how we structure the deals. I think the other key thing that I see, which is a little bit more challenging, is that whole additionality piece. It is really challenging for corporates to determine what that initial baseline is. How do we structure and show that we can do anything above and beyond, and also to ensure that it is also aligned with that management or that corporate ambition, right? And also to showcase that down the road, there is that ability to meet, that ability to monitor it, to report, and to really verify that this is a truly impactful thing that we can incorporate in. So I think if we have the right data sources that comes through to build the type of data ecosystem that we need, and the selective kind of data set that is required, which is truly accountable from a science-based perspective, that will give a lot more comfort internally when we discuss with the credit, with the coverage, with clients on how we can use these data set for our reporting of deals.
Prof.
On top of what Shilpa and Audrey said, maybe I can add two more. One is regulatory uncertainty. I think this is what we are seeing in today's geopolitical tensions, which began to affect all ESG issues, including nature and biodiversity. I mean, this global biodiversity framework is made under the UN framework, and we sort of have this Paris Agreement in biodiversity, and Paris Agreement, as we all know, is facing a headwind, and we are facing something similar. So how do companies navigate through this regulatory uncertainty under today's political tension background? I think it's an important one. Another one I want to emphasize is this, I would call instrument complexity. That for nature swap, sustainability linked bonds and loans. Of course, if you're in the industry, you understand. And but I think for most companies, investors, they still feel, this is too structured products. What is there for the layman? I think how to convey the message and simplify, and including blended finance. How do you structure different capital sources? How do you simplify this, make it more communicatable to investors, to decision makers? I think that's another important aspect to consider.
Dr. Joshua, saving the best for you.
Saving the best, if you put me at the last, then I don't know what to say. I don't want to compete with the world-class Professor Liang and the two other very senior bankers here. Okay, I have two components. One component is, since you asked a question, my own wish list. And the second component is rounding up this session, just a summary of it. Sincerely, I feel strongly that the whole world, whether the business community or the retail investors whom we represent in Singapore under SIAS, or as a human being. So most of them, including those who are living inside the forests as foresters, we are mostly thinking only two issues in the world. One issue is digital disruption, which is AI, everybody is talking about that. And number two, tariffs, geopolitical issue. So everybody worry whether that businesses affected or not. I just finished a meeting here at PSA. I'm just using their space to do this call. We had the same discussion too. So because of transshipment, the volume has increased for PSA. I was quite happy. The volume has increased for PSA operation. So anyway, these two issues really bogged down quite a fair bit on global citizens. whether the companies, board members, major investors like my company. So, but the critical one for all of us, are we going to be underwater? Touchwood will not. There is a high possibility. Are we going to be underwater? Are we going to be affected by natural calamities due to whatever? So nature and biodiversity is so critical. The current, I classify two enemies for nature and biodiversity is digital disruption and geopolitics. I'm not here to argue nature biodiversity is so important than these two. Yes, it is important. But if we don't have a food, if we don't have a country to live, our house to live, where are we now? What are we going to talk about? That is my strong message. I want to leave it here. We cannot conveniently forget the natural issue, which is nature and biodiversity, and give highest priority for other two. Yeah. So if we keep on giving higher priority, say example, artificial intelligence, let me quote some statistics and numbers. Yeah, everything goes well. Most of them will lose job, fine, no issues. But artificial intelligence will increase the productivity worth of $20 trillion in the world. $20 trillion increase in the value of productivity by adopting only about 25-30% of companies on AI, at the cost of huge damage to the nature and biodiversity. I'm not fascinated with the $20 trillion benefit, But the major disruption, the destruction to nature and biodiversity. So that's what I want to leave some thoughts and empirical proof. We should look at nature biodiversity equally and take ownership of that. But last part is I just want to thank all the participants and the panelists. The beginning of this session this year, the founder and president of SIAS, Mr. David Gerald, myself, and the senior management of SIAS, like Pauline and Lucas, few of us chit-chat. What are we going to do this year? So we said finally we came up with the nature and biodiversity. Then you say, who is going to give a speech? Is it the green and sustainability people? No. Let us get some academician. Then it's very hard to go and find somebody who master in this area, green and sustainability. Thanks to Prof. Liang, we found you, and we really enjoyed all your speech on behalf of SIAS. Really, thank you for that. And when we look at the bankers, we look at, okay, bankers, do we want the normal bankers or anything? Then we got into, we need some specific people who are really involved in offering financing, both green and nature. So that's why we almost forced Shilpa, who are traveling extensively on block leave and Diwali. So we forced DBS management, please get her to give a speech because we want to have that particular type of people. So I'm glad, thanks to Gerald for giving such a good idea. We have a diversity of people to join and provide a thought-provoking discussion and with the only one aim, no pre-questions, no prepared answers, no preparing with the specific things what we achieve. Thanks to you, Hanwei. Really appreciate. Over to you.
Thank you. And of course, Audrey, yes, whom I've met like a few weeks ago at the biodiversity conference that Prof organized at SMU. So thank you so much to like all our panelists today. I learned a lot. I enjoy a lot in terms of our sharing of like expertise and your perspective. And also definitely thank you to our audience, our attendees for joining us this morning. We hope that, it kind of like gives you more idea, encourage you to kind of think more deeply about, a nature positive and sustainable future. And thank you once again and enjoy the rest of the day.